the group. And I was thinking about intersectionality, which I think, by the way, is a painfully obvious idea. You know, the idea that you can be classified among many group dimensions and that there's social status consequences to all of those and that they interact. But I think intersectionality is actually the discovery of the fatal flaw of identity politics. Because if you fragment people down, if you allow their group identities to multiply and interact, then you get to the point where each individual is a unique nexus of group identities. And I actually think that that's what Western culture discovered over the last several thousand years, that the logical endpoint is the individual. And if you take everyone's advantages and disadvantages into account optimally, then what you do is you treat them as individuals, like there isn't anyone else like them in some sense, except in terms of their common, say, divine value, or something approximating that.
That's right. If you followed it to its logical conclusion, then the worst aspects of identitarianism would vanish because, as you say, everybody ultimately becomes a group of one. Unfortunately, of the 20 or 30 dimensions on which one could categorize people, it's really only 3 that matter. It's straight, white males. That's really where it's at. So, well,
that's worth digging into, you know, because that's actually illustrative, I would say, to some degree of the actual motivations. It's like there is all these identities, and hypothetically there's nothing to distinguish them in terms of primacy, even in terms of their effect, say, on socioeconomic outcome. So then it seems to me to be a victimizer narrative that's driving the idea that it's straight white males that in some sense have the phenomenal upper hand, which is another thing I don't really buy. I mean, most of the dangerous jobs are done by men. And so,
you know, in terms of who's, you know, in terms of who has power and wealth, you know, straight white men. I mean, I think we can plead guilty to that the world is not perfectly equal across all categories. We certainly can't dispute that. But I think what we're seeing now in very sharp relief since the Sarah Jeong controversy in the New York Times recently is this. I think it was Brett Weinstein said a year or two ago, there are some people who see inequality and want to end it. There are other people who see inequality and want to reverse it. At the time, I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. But I think the Sarah Jeong controversy, where the New York Times hired a young Korean-American person to join the op-ed, the editorial page, and it was discovered that she had all these nasty anti-white tweets. And the fact that there was a discussion and debate, like many people would say, oh, by definition, there's no such thing as anti-white racism. It's okay to say terrible things about white people. It's okay, and here's the key thing. It's okay to look at someone and based on the way they look, dislike them and treat them badly. Mm-hmm. And if you think that's okay, then this is the problem. This is common enemy identity politics. Yeah. Whereas if you think that's horrible, we shouldn't be judging people based on their race, then you're probably a supporter of common humanity identity politics, as we are.
I actually would like to slightly push back against the idea that it's just straight white men anymore. I felt like, I always feel like, unfortunately, sort of like the Stanford, Palo Alto / San Francisco Bay Area is unfortunately way ahead on these trends. And I think one of the reasons why you are seeing pushback from a lot of minority members as well is partially because for a long time, at least among the friends I know who really believe in this in almost like a religious kind of way, they're extremely guilty about simply being cisgendered, as in non-transgendered. That you'll see sort of this call-out culture applied to straight black men, for example. So I do think that we've been falling deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole where people are realizing, wow, so this is just a permanent situation of guilt and shame about an identity that I have no control over. That can't possibly be right.
Well, the other thing we should point out, too, is that even if you do make allowances for the fact that, let's say, on average, straight white men are doing or have done relatively well economically, it's also very much worth pointing out that it's a tiny minority of straight white men who have been doing spectacularly well. You know, so you have a Pareto distribution problem within each ethnic identity group. And so to say that because on average the socioeconomic status of a given group is higher than the status of another group, all the people who are members of that group are disproportionately benefiting is actually a rather, I would say, a rather motivated and resentful analysis, because it is always a tiny proportion of people in a group that are doing spectacularly well. And then you have to do something else, which is you have to look at that proportion that are doing spectacularly well, and you have to decide about how many of them are doing well because they actually deserve it, and how many of them are doing well because they're inappropriate rent seekers. And I would say, because our culture is pretty damn functional, and because we do generate a lot of wealth along with the inequality, that there's a fair number of people who are doing disproportionately well, who are doing that by benefiting everyone else. And we're not very careful about making those sorts of distinctions, and they're actually crucial.
That's right. So that's what we do. So in chapter 11, we go into social justice. And many people have claimed social justice is a meaningless term. It's thrown around in certain ways. People can't define it. But after digging into it, we decided that it actually is meaningful, but we have to break it down into its component parts. And so we go into what is the psychology of justice. And if you focus on distributive justice, are people getting what they deserve based on their inputs? Everybody recognizes when people are being cheated that they're, like in America now, a lot of low-wage workers, the companies have found ways to skimp on benefits and on pay. So that is a violation of distributive fairness. People recognize that that is wrong. If that is disproportionately affecting one race, or if people are being cheated because they are members of any identity group, that is a violation, I would say, of social justice, or of justice applied to identity groups. That, we think, is a very important concept. Similarly, procedural justice. If the criminal justice system ends up, for whatever reason, giving better representation to some groups than others, or treating people differently at any point, that is a violation of justice, which can plausibly be called a violation of social justice. What we push back against is the shift in recent years to this obsessive emphasis on outcomes. Mm-hmm. This is what most of the social justice argument seems to be on campus, is you just say, look, men are overrepresented, among coders. Well, they're not overrepresented among all other functions at Google and Apple. If you look at everyone else in the company, it's 50-50 or very close. It's only in certain job classifications where there's a disparity. And so people take that as ipso facto proof of systemic sexism. And what we really push back hard on is saying that's lazy, that's unfair, that's inaccurate. That's an invitation. Those disparities are an invitation to look closer. And if you see that the pipeline is 50-50, but the outcome isn't, well, then you've got a strong case. But if the pipeline from grad programs in computer science is exactly the same as the representation among coders at Google and Apple, well, you have to do something to show that people are being treated differently. So we think there's a lot of bad thinking done in the service of prosecuting one's political agenda within the culture war, and that a lot of people don't know how to stand up to it.
And one thing that I find interesting, that this should become a blasphemous argument, is personal preference, particularly when people talk about genders. I mean, if you've ever actually read, for example, the speech that got Larry Summers in so much trouble,
incredibly nuanced.
His final conclusion is that it's probably mostly that these are not, a lot of these jobs are not, are jobs that a lot of the theoretical physics things, they don't have a lot of appeal to women. He basically comes down on preference. Some reason saying that there might actually be a reason why veterinary science is overwhelmingly women, and some of these mathematical fields are overwhelmingly men. It might have something to do with it. Some small difference in what people actually like doing. Somehow that's
the funny thing too is, so the London Times just did an article this week on two papers that came out. It was quite an interesting article, because one of the papers came out showing once again that the personality differences between men and women are largest in the most egalitarian societies. And they actually get quite large by psychological standards in countries like Holland and or the Netherlands, and also in the Scandinavian countries, which are the most egalitarian countries. But the biggest difference between men and women, and also one that grows in more egalitarian countries, is in interest. And that difference is more than a standard deviation. It's like 1.5 standard deviations. And so it's more than enough to account for the disparity between male engineers and female engineers and male nurses. And the fact that it grows as societies become more egalitarian is actually a death blow to social constructionist theory.
That's right. So let's go into this in a bit of detail, because I think this is a really helpful area where I think we have a good idea what's going on, and we can see why it's so hard to find the truth here. When I taught at UVA, I had a lecture on sex and gender, and I went into sex differences. And the clear finding for many decades is that if you look at differences in ability between men and women, they're very few and far between. Men are better at spatial rotation. Women, on some measures, are a little better at social skills and at language. So there are some differences, but they're few and far between. if you look at the differences in what kids like, in what they choose to do when there's no adult watching, they're huge. Little boys and girls play radically differently. My wife and I, we once gave my triplet nephews, and they were 4 years old, we gave them a bag of plastic dinosaurs. And the two boys grabbed the dinosaurs and they start battling. They're bashing them together. And the girl takes two dinosaurs and she says, "Don't ever leave me, Mommy. I won't leave you, baby." So,
right.
Anecdote. But the point is, girls and boys play really differently. And if they're supervised by adults, the differences get smaller. Whereas if you let kids play on their own, the differences get bigger. Differences in interest are huge. And
Right, that's a crucial finding.
Yeah,
that's right.